Hey guys, it's Goosebumps Completionist, and today I'm bringing you another book review from the Give Yourself Goosebumps series. And it's book number 3, Trapped in Batwing Hall. Now, for starters, I vaguely remember picking this book up as a kid, and I remember staring at the cover and playing through it a little bit. But in terms of story, I didn't remember much. So, on this little mini vacation I went on this past few days, I decided to bring this one because I had multiple copies, and me and my girlfriend Buddy read this book, and I have to say, this is one of the weaker Give Yourself Goosebumps books I've encountered. Not in terms of it being bad. I don't think this is a bad book whatsoever, but I just think that this book is just a disappointment through and through. This is one of the Give Yourself Goosebumps books in this series, and I would say majority of them kind of follow this, where it's specifically story-based for the most part, and there's no gameplay function, none of that. And sometimes with these books, when they're predicated on the story carrying the narrative and carrying the experience of the book, you find yourself in a scenario where you pretty much have a 50-50 shot whether the story's really going to land and be good, or the story's going to be really mid or average, or sometimes even bad. And in the case of this book, I say that this book has to be one of the most lopsided books I've ever seen, because one arc is really bad, in my opinion. I'm not a fan of it whatsoever from beginning to end of it. And the other arc is just decent to light good at best. And I know I'm getting ahead of myself, but if I had to say a book not to start with in the series, don't start with this book. And I know that might be a controversial statement to make, because some people apparently really enjoy this book. And I'm not trying to knock people that like this, but this is one of the most boring things I've ever had to read in Goosebumps. It's one of the most mediocre things I've ever encountered in Goosebumps. And all in all, one of the most forgettable things I've ever encountered in Goosebumps. And it's sad because on paper, a lot of this stuff seems like right up my alley. And I'll get into that in just a minute. But it just didn't really land for me. But with that being said, let's get into the plot overview about this book without giving too much away, okay? So, what attracted me to this book was that there's this concept that felt like something I would really enjoy. Reading the back blurb of this sounded like this would be something like The House of No Return meets something like Are You Terrified Yet? And I really enjoy those stories. So in a Give Yourself Goosebumps book format, I thought this should be a shoo-in for me. But I'll save what I want to get into for the end of the video. It just didn't end up the way I was expecting. But in these Give Yourself Goosebumps books, you really need to understand one key thing before we go any further, is that you are the main character of the story. And what I mean by you is that you are playing yourself as the main character in these stories, and you get to go down pretty much the whole story, picking the paths that you choose to pick, or if you want to cheat and use bookmarks, you can play it like that. There's really no written rules how to play it, but you typically end up in a situation where you're, after the first few pages, you end up at a dividing line, and you go down one arc or the other. And this one is pretty much bare bones, Give Yourself Goosebumps. It's no gameplay, none of that. It's just strictly story, where you go down your first few pages, and then you find the dividing line, and you pick one arc or the other. Now, in this story, you are a new kid at this new school, and you meet this kid named Nick. And Nick is a really cool kid. He seems to be into horror, and you're really into horror too, and you guys kind of hit it off. And after talking, he invites you to come to a meeting at this house that belonged to this really kooky guy of the neighborhood that you all live in, but he passed away a few years ago. And this club called the Horror Club is a group of kids that meet in his old house that's kind of torn, like run down and, you know, kind of tattered. And he wants you to become the newest member. So you, of course, are dying to make new friends, and you want to, you know, meet the Horror Club and share stories and hope they like your stories. And that to me kind of reminded me of like the Midnight Society in a lot of ways, and I was getting my hopes up, right? And it also kind of reminded me of the element that Chris Wakely went through in House of No Return, and then of course what Craig Morgenstern went through in Are You Terrified Yet? So at this point of the story, I'm like, where is this going to go? So you play the main character, and you're going through all these pages, and you end up at the house of this old kooky guy. And once you enter, you meet the horror club, but the horror club is at odds with you being there. Some of them don't want you to be there, and some of them are really open and welcome. And the people that are open and welcome to you, you really make a mental note of that. And the people that are mean to you, you're like, maybe I should avoid them, right? But Nick convinces them that, since you're already here, why not give you a test run of sorts? And for that night specifically that you arrive at the house, it is game night, and the theme is scavenger hunting. And what they've decided to do is they decided to break up in 2 teams of 3, and you're going to be the 4th wheel, either on one team, which is the red team, or the blue team to go on this scavenger hunt. Now, if you go on the red team, this is the choice, my preferable choice in the story, and I guess I'll start here. If you go on the red team arc, this group of kids are the kids that weren't really receptive to you being there. But once you join, you feel like, I think you make the decision because if you pick that arc, your character has said, well, you kind of want to win them over and show them that you're worthy. And since the other kids are already nicer to you, you don't really have to impress them as much. So you pick the red team, and this arc requires that you have to go on the scavenger hunt inside of this kooky man's house. And there's a downstairs and an upstairs portion, and you're like, well, this is getting kind of weird, and something feels off about the situation, and you try to leave, but the 3 kids that you're with end up showing themselves to be monsters. And these monsters are essentially trying to peer pressure you into doing this scavenger hunt, and you have to find a list of items. And the list of items are an actual human bone from a skeleton. You have to find 3 werewolf hairs, mummy bandages, and a piece of broomstick from a witch's broom. So, if you don't find these items on the scavenger hunt by midnight and complete the list, then you're going to be turned into a monster just like one of them. And if you complete the list, you get to escape with your life. So you reluctantly are forced into this situation here in the Red Arc. And almost immediately, these 3 kids start chasing after you, and your first task is to at least find an item to get the list going. And while they're scaring you, you end up finding your first item, which is a human hand found in a shoebox in a closet. And there's a really creepy scene where they force you to crack off a bone from the hand and put it with you to keep it as an item. And I thought that was a really good scene. And then, of course, we haven't talked about the endings yet throughout this arc. But I would say this as an overall problem. As long as you stay on the correct path and avoid these endings, you don't have to read some really just lame endings here. And we'll get into that near the end of the video. But yeah, some of these short endings that you end up coming across in this arc is really lame. But after you find the hand, the next object you need to find are some bandages. Now, at one point, if you go down one part of the arc, you think you find bandages in the kitchen, but you have this interaction with one of the monster kids, and it's kind of funny. And they redirect you to this area of the house where you can find the mummy bandages. And you end up finding a mummy box, and you go over to it, and the mummy ends up breaking out. And the mummy tries to chase you down and stuff, and there's also an alternate arc that you can go down if you pick specific choices, is that there's like a pyramid part of it, where you get to go to the pyramid, where it's from and stuff, and try to corner it there, and there's some ancient Egyptian characters there. It's kind of wonky, kind of cliche, but yeah, what can I say? But there is a point where you end up getting the bandages from the mummy. The mummy has his back turned, and you're able to either cut it off or rip it off, and you'll have, I don't want to spoil the endings of those because those were kind of good, but those are two options. If you pick the right one, you end up getting the bandages. And then once you figure out that these kids are still following you around downstairs, and you feel like you've reached all the rooms you need to go to, you realize that the only way to go is upstairs, because there's a downstairs and an upstairs portion to the scavenger hunt. You need to get the items probably from monsters upstairs. And you start having this countdown of sorts when you realize the time, and it's getting really close to midnight, and you're really crunched on time and are pushing to get this done as fast as possible. So you end up in the attic, and you encounter this box with a howling witch inside of it. And the witch is so thankful that you helped her, she ends up letting you take her broomstick and pretty much use it for your scavenger hunt. But by doing so, she kind of talked your ear off and dwindled down time to about 10 minutes. And she poofs away, and she tells you to take the elevator all the way down to the basement, and that's where you'll find the werewolf. And the last part of the story is where you end up in the basement, you're encountering the werewolf, and there's a couple of funny scenes. If you go down one path, you can take a detour from actually going to the basement, and you just end up finding these kids that are monsters playing this video game, and you kind of wager with them to play the video game instead to, free yourself. And there's an ending where I guess it could be considered a true ending, where you end up beating them at the video game, and you get to go home and you play the same video game with your brother at home. But if you keep playing through to the werewolf part, you get to essentially try to trap a werewolf. And the werewolf is kind of upset, and you end up trapped in the cage with it, and the monster kids are overlooking, laughing at you and counting down the time, and you're pretty much like on a buzzer beater kind of situation where you better get this done before this exact time or you're screwed. And if you manage to pick the right choices, you end up getting the 3 werewolf hairs just in time. And let's just say it's not through the way that you would expect to. It's not like you're plucking these werewolf hairs. It's very corny, because you have to tell the werewolf to like sit and shake and stuff like a dog. It's really bizarre. But you end up with all the items right at midnight. And when you do so, all the kids disappear. And you're pretty much back in the room of the house. And you're like, well, what happened? And you see all the horror kids huddled up in the living room. And there's a big revelation about why the scavenger hunt was a thing. And that's really the true ending of this arc. And that's essentially the Red Arc. The Red Arc was kind of fun all over the place, but had its moments of, funny jokes and some creepy scenes there. But the Blue Arc, if you want to go all the way back and touch on the Blue Arc, in my opinion, is absolutely bad. The Blue Arc is terrible. Okay, so you end up going with the blue team, and the blue team is all the kids that were nice to you, essentially. And for them, they want to take you on an alternate route of the scavenger hunt. They want to take you outside and kind of give you an initiation of sorts. This is more of like a go find a scary object somewhere and bring it back. And if we're impressed by the object you bring, we'll let you in the horror club kind of thing. So they immediately take you outside and direct you towards the cemetery nearby. And once you go to the cemetery, you end up finding the gravestone of the guy that used to live in the house that the horror club hangs out in. Now, while at the gravestone, there is an ominous sign hanging above his gravestone, saying that if you turn the door or whatnot, you'll be turned into a bat, right? And now that I mention it, the mansion is called Batwing Hall. That's why the title is Trapped in Batwing Hall, by the way. But it gives credence to why it's called Batwing Hall, right? So, no matter what decision you make at the gravestone, you end up getting turned into a bat. And one storyline involves either you can just go try to tell your friends immediately that this has happened to you, or the other storyline is you can go home and try to see what happens and deal with it the following day. Now, if you try to tell your friends immediately what happens, you find yourself trying to find the homes of the kids that you were just with. And two of them don't really matter. One story arc takes you to this girl's house, and you end up getting pretty much crushed by a bookcase. And it's kind of cool because you're trying to get help, and you're using like these little cardboard letters that babies use to learn how to spell to try to communicate with her. And she goes on this whole thing about trying to capture you and become famous off of you because you can spell and communicate with people. It's really kooky. And then another one involves one of the kids' dads capturing you and taking you to the local zoo. And the true ending with this one is if you pick the girl that you think is kind of cute, and you go over to her house, and she ends up understanding you, and you get a kind of a corny ending. I'm not going to spoil it. But that's the arc if you tell them outright. Now, if you wait till the next day, what ends up happening is you end up waking up the next morning, but you're turned back into a human. And you're thinking like, okay, well, maybe all this never really happened, right? But it turns out that you realize you're no longer craving human food. You're now craving stuff like beetles and bugs and stuff. And you realize that you still are probably a bat, but during the day you get to regain human form, and once nightfall hits, you turn into a bat. And you have this concept where when you go outside, it's blistering hot, right? Well, that same night, you are like, well, I'm trying to deal with it outright, and there comes a point in the story where you get a phone call. I think it happened before this, though, where the girl that you have a crush on wants you to come meet them at the mall, and their mom leaves you a note, and you can either go to the mall or go try to like figure it out for yourself. And if you go try to figure it out for yourself, you get like an abrupt ending that ends up just taking you to the mall arc anyway. But if you go to the mall arc, your friends want to see a movie, and you're covered up in a turtleneck and stuff, and you're like, let's go see the movie. And during the movie, since it's dark in there, you feel yourself starting to turn into a bat. Now, once you turn into a bat, you realize that you have to get out of the theater and wait for them after the fact once the movie's over. And they ask you, what's going on? Now you have the option to tell them immediately or tell them later that night when the horror club meets. And if you wait till that night, right? Yeah, if you tell them immediately, one thing happens. But if you wait to tell them that night, it takes you down one arc where there's like a true ending involved. But all the kids, let's just say, all the kids end up getting turned into other animals, and it's just really nonsensical stuff that makes no sense. It involves the warning on the grave marker, and there's this concept where you can't misuse it more than once a year. And since you get to retain your human form after all this happens, but two of your friends get turned into monsters, you now have to be the caretaker of them. It's really stupid. But probably the better ending of this arc is when you tell them immediately, and they believe you, and you end up you know, I don't know how to spoil this. Well, you have some ghostly encounters with like the guy that used to live in Batwing Hall and stuff, and you get to go down some side quests if you decide to go down that route. But if your friends believe you and they see you turn into a bat once nightfall hits, they'll follow you, and you pretty much get a similar type of ending. But this route, I can't remember if it's this route or the route that you go if you decide to go by yourself and handle it. Has somewhat of an interesting angle where you get to go inside of the crypt and you get trapped in there, and you end up falling down this like big pit underneath the crypt, and you end up in this library where these monsters kind of run the library, and there's this thing called the swamp monster that's rumored to be there, and you're trying to figure out how to get back to the crypt and stuff like that. And the true ending there is, well, there's two. One is that you end up becoming a librarian for these monsters forever, and the other one is you end up going back to the crypt, but it ends up being the wrong crypt, and it's the swamp monster's crypt. You know what I mean? But yeah, that's essentially Trapped in Batwing Hall. It's kind of all over the place. Not really a lot to talk about. And there's a lot of endings in this story that are just kind of cornball and left field, and we'll get into that in just a minute. But yeah, that's essentially the story. So let's get some positives off the bat. I think one thing that this story has going for it is the concept of it. I think the horror club angle is really cool. While there's no game function here, I do appreciate the red art going down this peer pressure angle. It kind of elevated some tension in that arc throughout the the path that you're supposed to follow. I felt the villains in that arc were kind of fun. I really dug it. It had a lot of, I don't know, similar tones to like stories like Calling All Creeps and stories like Are You Terrified Yet, with Craig getting like peer pressured and stuff to do these dares. It felt similar to that, and I got some fix of what I was looking for out of that arc because of those characters and what they were doing to you, and such. There were some creepy scenes in the book. I really appreciated the skeleton in the closet scene, breaking off the bone. That was really creepy. There's a couple of really grotesque scenes involving the monsters and showcasing like what their bodies do and stuff. That was cool. And I think this one is more of the played for laughs stories in the Give Yourself Goosebumps series. And there were some funny moments in the red arc, and I would even say the blue arc. Some ironically fun moments here. But yeah. Aside from that, I have a decent amount of negatives with this, but they're not really high hitting ones. They're just a couple of little small to medium ones that kind of add up. The first issue I have with this overall book here is that this is one of the times in Give Yourself Goosebumps where there's no gameplay function, and the gameplay function, or the lack thereof, really suffers for the story here, because the story is not that intriguing enough to carry it without some gameplay with it. And I think if even the stuff like the scavenger hunt list and the red arc, which had no gameplay function to it whatsoever, even if that was played to be a game, more so than what we got in the book, I still think it needed more than that. When I'm thinking of a scavenger hunt storyline in a game, and you have to find specific items, I would want some stakes with these items. Maybe you can have like a backpack where you store the items and you have to use the items to unlock another room of the arc, or these items end up uncovering or potentially being items you need to unlock a specific part of the house. We had none of that. It was just really simple. And it was just more played for story purposes than game purposes. And then in the blue arc, that really had no gameplay. In the blue arc, it's just you being a bat trying to turn back into a human. And it's just really forced in things in that arc because, like I said, it's relying on the story here, and it just a lot of stuff just feels kind of left fieldish, because I don't know who wrote this. I don't know if Stein wrote this or whoever Ghost wrote this book, but I feel like they were like throwing in the towel with a lot of these endings, because I guess they realized that they didn't have a good idea for the gameplay function of this book, so they just didn't do one, and they just forced some stuff in there and just said, here you go, this is passable. It was really frustrating, right? I just feel like if it had that, it could have made the more mundane aspects of the story kind of liven up a bit. And I kind of already touched on this, but a second negative would be, specifically in the blue arc, there's so many forced things in this book that feel completely random. Like, there'll be moments of the story where you're reading something, right? And you're getting near an ending. And there'll be a random mechanism thrown in there to kind of shoehorn in the ending that came out of nowhere, that you have not encountered before in the story, that really makes no sense why it's put in there, but it's there to force in the ending. And you see that not just once, twice, but it's like 3 or 4 times. And it's just really kind of jarring. Like, I know Give Yourself Goosebumps is known for like its randomness and its off the wall nature, but in this book it was very, very, very off putting to see like random mechanisms thrown in just to shoehorn in ideas, and you see it a lot in the blue arc. I would say more so than the red arc, and that was really annoying, really annoying. And I think an overall problem for the whole book, I would say, is that throughout I want to say many Give Yourself Goosebumps books I've read, but in some, I've noticed that sometimes these writers, when they're kind of stretching themselves thin on ideas, and this book is pretty much like a huge metaphor of stretching yourself thin on an idea, they come up with these little arcs that literally lead to nowhere, or they'll give you an option, right? And you have one or two options each page anyway. And the alternate option, you'll go to that, and then it will say, oh, you should have chose the other option, and just go ahead and take you to the option from the previous page before. So, like, why even include that there, right? It's literal padding. And this book has about at least 8 to 10 pages of that. It does it the most I've seen in these books, where it's pointless redirects that just end you up to the option that you should have picked. And the alternate option is literally there just to have an extra page in the book. It's annoying, and I hate it. And it's throughout both arcs. And I think you'll know what I'm talking about if you've read this book, or when you ever go to read this book, you will probably get frustrated with this as well, right? And thinking about it, that was like one of my only negatives I had with books like The Werewolf of Twisted Tree Lodge. That book is essentially perfect, minus that aspect to it. Here, it's way worse than that, but because that was only in like one part of one arc. This is in both arcs. And it really got under my skin. And I think the big culminating problem, if it's not the endings being typical cornball stuff, kind of just nonsensical, not quite cringy like some other books I've seen, it's the entirety of the blue arc for me was just an epic fail. It's not the idea of being turned into a bat and trying to fix yourself like from being a bat to becoming a human again. It's just that the majority of this arc didn't really do much in terms of story. You're just literally wandering around as a bat. There's a couple of mini little side quest things where you go and try to eat a bug and you get to learn your sonar and stuff. That's kind of cool. But other than that, there's a lot of pointless stuff in this arc. And if it's not the filler redirect pages, padding up page count, it's the blue arc here. I definitely feel like the blue arc was more lazily put together, and the true ending to the blue arc just really sours my opinion. And I think it's the one where you get to cure yourself, but some of your friends get the side effect, and you have to deal with them. That's pretty much the true ending there. It's not a real smart or clever thing to insert. And I feel like I'm rambling on at this point about this book, but if I'm being honest, y'all, this was not a good book. But it's not a bad book either. And I want to stress that. It's not a bad book. It has some solid positives, and the positives I did mention are pretty good ones. Like, there's nothing bad outright other than the blue arc in this book. And like I said, the red arc is a decently good time, I would say. Not the greatest thing ever, not the most spectacular thing ever. I wouldn't even consider it kind of memorable. But there are some things about it that made it enjoyable. So from a 0 to 5 star basis, I had to pretty much weigh this book half and half, because the red arc, I'm willing to say the red arc is about like a 3.5 out of 5 stars. But the blue arc, it made me laugh a couple times. There was some fun ideas, but it just went nowhere with it in terms of story. And I don't know. If it had some gameplay function, it could have been a little better, but I think I'd give this one maybe like a 2.8 out of 5 stars. It would be a D- bad arc. So I had to balance it out, and it put me between a 3.1 and a 3.3, and I decided to give this book about a 3.3 because I think it's a mediocre one, but I don't think it's that bad. You know, I do think that if I had to go out of my way to recommend this book, it would be for the Red Arc, and it truly is something to experience. It was kind of fun. So I had to give it some credit there. And that's why I gave this book like a 3.3 out of 5. I gave it a D. To me, it's not good, not bad. Slightly okay overall. I think the Blue Arc really takes it down. And I think what could remedy the whole book is some gameplay here, because the story's not strong enough to carry its own. And, you know, it just really makes me reflect on, you know, as I go along in this series, with these stories that don't have gameplay function to them. If they're going to be like weak like this, you might see some average scores of like 3.3s to 3.6s from this series for me, because if they're going to be weak stories like this, that's what they're going to get. So yeah, that's my thought on Trapped in Batwing Hall. Let me know down in the comment section if you've read this before. Do you love this or do you hate this? I'm dying to know. And I'll see you next time.